Did your family walk on eggshells or explode without warning?
During Christmas brunch, my brother looked at me over a plate of honey-glazed ham and said, with a smirk only an older sibling can perfect, I'd never waste my time on a startup. He didn't even blink when he said it, just scooped a forkful of scalloped potatoes like he dropped a casual opinion about the weather. Dad chuckled the way he always does when Jake says something obnoxious, but vaguely business-minded, like that default reaction was built into his ribcage sometime around 1992. The room was warm from the oven and wood-burning stove, the air thick with cinnamon, clove, and the kind of tension only families can ferment over decades of quiet dismissals and slow-growing disappointment. Then Aunt Carol, with her perfect timing and zero tolerance for bullshit, tilted her wine glass toward me and asked with a raised eyebrow, "Is that why you just made Forbes' Next 100? And I swear to God, the room didn't just freeze, it suffocated. But I didn't answer. Not yet. I looked at Jake's smirk morph into confusion, then something a little closer to fear. Dad's chuckle died in his throat. Linda, the type of woman who decorates with signs that say live, laugh, love, but never actually does any of the three, stirred her mimosa with a candy cane and pretended not to be listening, which was laughable, considering she'd been eavesdropping on me since I stepped through the front door. Let me rewind, just a bit. The truth is, I hadn't been home for Christmas in over 2 years. Not since the last brunch turned into what I'll politely call a disaster, although emotional mugging would be a more accurate term. That year, I'd shared, cautiously and maybe a little naively, that I was quitting my well-paying but soul-sucking job at the consulting firm to launch a tech startup with 2 friends from Stanford. We had an idea, a little funding, and a lot of sleepless nights ahead of us. I was terrified and thrilled. I thought my family would be, at the very least, supportive. What I got instead was a collective sigh of disappointment wrapped in bad jokes about being unemployed with extra steps. Jake had led the charge, of course, grinning like he'd been handed a punchline he'd been waiting his whole life to deliver. "You're gonna build an app," he'd said, dragging out the word app like it was something sticky on the bottom of his shoe. "Just make sure you have daddy on speed dial when you need to pay rent." Even Dad, who usually stayed neutral in these skirmishes, had offered a half-hearted chuckle before muttering something like, "I thought we raised you to be smarter than that." It stuck in my ribs, that sentence. For months. I didn't come home the following Christmas. And no one asked why. So walking into that house this year, pulling off my coat and hearing Jake bellow from the kitchen, "Look what the cat dragged in," felt like stepping back into a world I'd worked very hard to forget. The tree was already lit, ornaments dusted off from decades of use, each one representing a memory I was actively trying not to resurrect. There were the crocheted snowmen Mom had made before she passed. The gold star Dad refused to replace, even though it tilted sideways no matter how much we adjusted it. It all looked so familiar, and yet, none of it felt like home anymore. I took a seat at the table, careful to choose the chair furthest from Jake, closest to Aunt Carol. She offered a soft smile and an even softer, "It's good to see you, kid." I nodded, unable to say the same. The food was piled high and overly nostalgic, eggs with too much paprika, green bean casserole that no one under 70 enjoys, sweet rolls that could chip a tooth if you bit down wrong. Linda passed around her famous cranberry mousse, which was really just Jell-O with Cool Whip, but everyone pretended it was gourmet because that's what families do. They pretend. They decorate overwrought. And that's when Jake did it. Right after Dad asked him how work was going and he launched into a speech about his latest real estate investments, then pivoted effortlessly, smugly, into a monologue about real work and putting skin in the game. The man was basically quoting LinkedIn posts like they were scripture. I ignored it until he looked at me and said, out of nowhere, I'd never waste my time on a startup. No context. No provocation. Just one clean bullet to the chest, designed to humiliate me without raising his voice. He expected me to flinch. He always did. But before I could say a single word, before I could even reach for the gravy boat, Aunt Carol cut in. Calmly, almost lazily. "Is that why you just made Forbes' Next 100? And the room, loud and proud and full of its own echo, went still. Jake's hand hovered midair, knife glistening with honey glaze. Dad blinked like he'd misheard. Even the kids, usually too busy stabbing their iPads to care, looked up. I kept chewing very slowly, pretending not to notice the war I had just unintentionally declared. Because here's the thing they didn't know. No one at that table, aside from Aunt Carol, had the faintest idea that the past 2 years of my life had been more than a little side project or a fun distraction. They didn't know that what started in a cramped garage with 2 laptops and a whiteboard now had employees, real investors, and a multi-million-dollar acquisition deal that had closed just 13 days ago. They didn't know my name had been printed in Forbes next to some of the most powerful innovators in the country. They didn't know because I didn't tell them. Not out of spite. Out of self-preservation. Because after all the jokes, the mockery, the way they rolled their eyes when I said words like prototype or seed funding, I realized they weren't capable of hearing the truth. Not back then. But now? Now they would listen. And not because I needed them to, but because I was done hiding. I reached for my coffee, took a slow sip, and glanced around the table. I still hadn't said a word. But they were already starting to panic. And honestly, that was the best part. It's a strange sensation, sitting at a table surrounded by people who know your name, your childhood haircut, your second-grade report card, and the way your voice cracked the first time you sang at the Christmas recital. Yet somehow remain completely blind to the person you've become, because memory, in families like mine, doesn't evolve with time. It just ossifies into a version of you they once understood, and then choose to never update. As I watched Jake return to his carving duties, awkwardly quiet after Aunt Carol's verbal torpedo, and Dad begin to shift uncomfortably in his seat like someone who suddenly realizes they might have laughed at the wrong moment, I felt that all too familiar tightness in my chest, the one that comes not from confrontation, but from remembering just how long I'd been silently swallowing this nonsense to keep the peace that was never meant to be mine. The scent of burnt rolls pulled me back, Linda's contribution to the table, the only thing more undercooked than her self-awareness. She had forgotten them in the oven while trying to show off pictures of their family's summer trip to Aspen, complete with airbrushed smiles and a hashtagged caption about gratitude. I stared at the carbon-black dinner rolls as Jake waved away the smoke with a wet towel, and I thought, not for the first time, that symbolism has a way of arriving uninvited. I was 12 when I first realized that being Jake's sister meant being invisible by default. Not because I lacked talent or drive, but because he was louder, brasher, quicker to take credit, and more naturally tuned to the frequency our father respected, measurable wins, tangible outcomes, and confidence that bordered on arrogance. When he won his high school debate tournament, Dad took him out for steak. When I got into the regional science fair with a project on light reflection in polymer glass, Dad asked if I remembered to clean up the kitchen afterward. Smart, he'd said once, patting my head like a puppy that accidentally did a trick. But practical? We'll see. That sentence rang in my ears for years. Then came high school, where I buried myself in books and late-night coding projects, where my only escape from the world was behind a screen and the glow of possibility that maybe, one day, I'd build something that mattered, something no one could take credit for but me. Jake, meanwhile, had a revolving door of girlfriends and a GPA that relied heavily on extra credit and football stats. But every Thanksgiving, every birthday, every stupid barbecue, the story was always the same. Jake's doing great. Big promotions coming. He's got an eye for business. And me? I was the creative one, which in family language is just a polite way to say, we don't get what she does, but bless her heart. Even when I got accepted to Stanford, the first words out of Dad's mouth weren't, congratulations, but do you know what that's going to cost? Like ambition was a burden. Like he was already tired of the success I hadn't even begun to pursue. And the truth is, for a long time, I internalized it. I started down the corporate route because it felt like the only way to be taken seriously. I wore the blazer. I took the safe job. I played the part of someone who had stability, even if it made me feel like I was drowning in beige cubicles and quarterly reviews that measured my ability to nod along in meetings. But the resentment festered quietly, feeding off every family dinner where Jake bragged about interest rates and rental yields while Dad nodded with that look of paternal approval that I could never quite access. It wasn't anger, it was erosion. So when I quit that job 2 years ago, I didn't tell them. I didn't invite them into my new world because I already knew what they'd say. I could hear it in my head before they even opened their mouths. You're taking a big risk. You sure you're ready for that? What about your 401k? And Jake, always ready with a dagger disguised as brotherly advice. Just don't come crying when it fails. It's funny how fear can sometimes look like ambition to people who've never stepped outside a blueprint. I spent the last 24 months working 12-hour days in a converted garage, eating more instant ramen than I care to admit, pitching to investors who barely looked me in the eye until I showed them the prototype. Building a product with two brilliant women who also knew what it meant to be overlooked, and slowly, inch by inch, turning a pipe dream into a platform that now had tens of thousands of users and a valuation none of my relatives could even begin to comprehend. But here, in this house, with its dented cookie tins and reused wrapping paper, I was still the artsy one. Still Claire with her ideas. Until now. And it wasn't about the Forbes list. That was just punctuation. The real story was the sweat. The stretch of nights I didn't sleep because I thought the servers would crash. The calls with lawyers. The mentors who told me I was doing something no one in my space had done before, and the creeping fear that maybe that wasn't a compliment, it was a warning. The real story was the version of me I had to become alone, while everyone else at this table assumed I was off somewhere painting or journaling in a coffee shop. Now, watching Jake poke at his food in silence, glancing at me with something between envy and disbelief, I realized the tables were finally starting to turn, not because I fought them for power, but because I stopped needing their permission to have any. Aunt Carol caught my eye and smiled, not the pitying kind, but the kind that says, about damn time. She had always been the only one who didn't talk down to me, who sent articles about funding strategies, who once slipped me a $100 check, just because I know sometimes dreamers need a little cushion. When Mom died, Aunt Carol stepped up, not loudly, but consistently. I think part of her always knew what I was capable of. And today, with one simple question, she cracked the illusion this family had built around Jake's unearned supremacy. Still, I said nothing. I let the silence bloom. Jake's kids giggled in the living room, oblivious. Linda was already on her phone, Googling Forbes Next 100, pretending it was casual. And I sat there, sipping my lukewarm coffee, wondering if they even deserved to know the whole story. Because the truth wasn't just power. It was leverage. And I wasn't done yet. It's astonishing how, in some families, even the truth needs to pass through a filter of sarcasm, assumption, and hierarchy before it's permitted to exist out loud. And sitting there at the table, watching Jake take another smug sip of his orange juice like the monarch of some suburban kingdom, I realized that no matter how much you build, earn, or change, some people will grip their version of you like a security blanket they refuse to release. Because if they let go, if they dared to see who you've actually become, it might mean accepting that they've been wrong all along, and worse, that they were never the center of the damn universe. The question came casually, as though it weren't designed like a little knife wrapped in ribbon. Jake had waited just long enough for the silence to settle, for the shock from Aunt Carol's truth grenade to dull into confusion, before he leaned back in his chair and turned his attention to me with a grin that wasn't kind, wasn't curious, and definitely wasn't brotherly. So, he said, dragging the vowel like he was giving the floor to a child about to recite a school poem. You're still doing that little tech thing, huh? The app or website or whatever. That's still going. There was something in the way he said still, like my work was an old car that had miraculously made it through another year without breaking down, something quaint and ultimately temporary, like I'd stumbled into luck rather than earned every inch of it. He didn't ask with interest, didn't open the door for real dialogue, but rather set the scene for a punchline I had no interest in hearing again. I glanced at Dad, who was already chuckling, not a big laugh, just that breathy half-laugh he uses when he doesn't fully get the joke but knows it's at my expense. His shoulders were hunched like always, like they'd been carved into a permanent shrug from years of dental work and avoiding confrontation, but the look in his eyes wasn't amused, it was wary, as if some part of him sensed that this year I might not play the game the same way. Linda, ever the passive co-conspirator, chimed in with a tone that belonged more in a baby shower than a serious conversation. "That's so cute, Claire," she said, smiling in a way that felt more like a wince, as if success in the creative world didn't count unless it came with a husband, a house in a gated neighborhood, and a fridge full of oat milk. "I always think it's brave when women follow their passions. You know, even if it doesn't always pay off." I resisted the urge to laugh, not because I found it funny, but because there's a kind of tragic comedy in being gaslit by your own blood while they chew on your cooking and insult you with the napkin still in their laps. I looked at my plate, then up at Aunt Carol, whose expression hadn't changed since brunch began, a calm, patient defiance that radiated through her wine glass like a quiet flame. Before I could speak, she cleared her throat, not loud, not dramatic, but just enough to make the whole table pause. "You all saw the list, didn't you?" she asked flatly. "Claire's not some teenager with a Tumblr blog. She's building something. Something that's already made more progress in 2 years than most of you have in 10. Jake let out a laugh, too fast, like a reflex. "Come on, Carol. Let's not get carried away. I mean, no offense, Claire, but we're just talking about an article. Everyone gets written up these days. LinkedIn's basically a high school yearbook for adults. I mean, you've got influencers who take selfies in their bathrobes and end up with press. That doesn't mean you're a CEO." His voice carried that familiar condescension, the kind he always laced his words with when he talked about my world, the tech world, the creative world, the soft world, as he called it once after too much whiskey at Dad's retirement party. He lived in a numbers-obsessed, status-worshipping, real estate hustle kind of space where nothing counted unless it came with contracts and closing costs. And now, faced with something he didn't understand, he did what all men like Jake do, he mocked it. But this time, I didn't flinch. I placed my fork down, folded my napkin slowly, and met his gaze head-on, not with fire, but with something colder. Sharper. The kind of silence you only earn after watching someone underestimate you for decades. "You're right," I said evenly. "Everyone does get written up these days. But not everyone gets their company acquired for 7 figures. Not everyone builds a platform that's used in 6 countries. And not everyone lands on a list curated by a team of venture capital analysts, editors, and tech innovators with more credibility in their inbox than you've got in your entire LinkedIn network." There was no shouting. No grand gesture. Just a slow wave of something real settling across the table, like dust finally clearing from a surface no one wanted to admit was filthy. Jake's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Dad blinked. Linda looked like someone had just told her brunch was canceled forever. And Aunt Carol, God bless her, took another sip of her wine and said, with a smile too soft to be accidental, "Well, now. Isn't that interesting?" And, just like that, the power shifted. Not explosively, not in a Hollywood climax kind of way, but in the slow, painful recognition that the old script no longer worked. They couldn't laugh me off anymore. They couldn't dismiss me as the weird one, the quiet one, the maybe she'll move back home eventually one. I'd rewritten the story. And I hadn't even told them the best part yet. Because they didn't know the acquisition papers had just been signed 2 weeks ago, that I was packing up my apartment in San Francisco to move to a brownstone in Boston, where I'd be spearheading an entire innovation wing for a national tech firm. That the deal included equity, autonomy, and a team of 15 engineers who actually listened when I spoke. They didn't know that venture capitalists now called me, not the other way around. That I had people to handle my calendar. That next year's Christmas, I wouldn't be here. But they would. Still circling the same tired jokes. Still measuring success by mortgages and marble countertops. Still asking each other what the kids were up to these days. And maybe they'd eventually realize what they missed. Or maybe not. Either way, I was done waiting for their permission to be real. And I still hadn't told them what I came here to say. There's a kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room. It stretches across it like a fog, heavy and deliberate, making even the smallest movements feel significant. Like shifting in your seat might accidentally detonate a truth everyone's trying very hard not to acknowledge, and in that moment, with the dishes cooling and the smell of overcooked ham lingering in the air like a relic from a better-intentioned past. I sat back and watched the people I had spent the first half of my life trying to impress finally run out of ways to dismiss me. It was subtle at first, the glance Jake shot at Dad, the way Linda suddenly seemed very interested in folding her napkin into neat little triangles, and the stiffness in my father's shoulders as though he'd just remembered a bill he forgot to pay. But it was happening undeniable and uncomfortable, like the floor had tilted slightly and none of them were sure how to stand on it. I could have let it end there. I could have leaned into the ambiguity, let the implication of success hang in the air without clarification, given them just enough doubt to keep them squirming and wondering and second-guessing their assumptions, but that wasn't why I came home. I didn't take the red-eye across the country, didn't sit through 2 hours of condescending small talk and half-hearted compliments about my pretty earrings and good posture, just to play it coy and walk away with the same invisible crown they'd always handed Jake by default. No, I came to finish what Aunt Carol started. I came to say what no one at that table expected me to say, and to finally, stop giving a damn about what it might sound like. So I set down my glass with careful intention, met every pair of eyes around that table, and spoke the sentence that would unravel the version of me they had held onto for so long it had become a family heirloom. Yes, I said, and my voice didn't shake, not even a little. The startup is still going. In fact, it's not really a startup anymore. It's been acquired. 2 weeks ago. Closed the deal right before Christmas. 7-figure agreement. Full autonomy. I'll be leading an innovation lab in Boston starting January. The words hung there like steam off a freshly poured kettle, hot, clear, and impossible to ignore. Jake blinked first, and the disbelief on his face was so pure, so utterly unmasked, that I could almost hear his internal monologue scrambling to update its narrative. He was the one who always won, the one whose career trajectory made sense, who wore the right suits and said the right buzzwords and married the kind of woman who wore pearls to brunch. He didn't know how to compute a world in which I had built something without his permission, without his input, without any of the approval or advice he'd always assumed I needed and had resented me for not asking. Dad, on the other hand, didn't speak at all, at least not immediately. He just stared at me, mouth slightly open, as if trying to piece together the exact moment he lost the thread of who I was. Maybe it was when I left consulting, or maybe it was when I stopped calling for advice about my taxes or whether to lease or buy a car. Or maybe it was way before that. Maybe it was when I was a teenager and he decided, quietly and with the kind of conviction that leaves little room for revision, that Jake was the leader and I was the odd one out, and that's how it was going to stay. Linda, always ready with a rehearsed empathy, offered a high-pitched, wow, which sounded more like a hiccup than genuine admiration. That's really something, she added, her voice faltering as she glanced nervously at her husband, probably searching for some kind of verbal escape hatch, as if maybe this whole thing was just a joke or misunderstanding that would resolve itself before dessert. But it wouldn't. And I wasn't done. We've been building this for 27 months, I continued, calmly, like I was giving a quarterly report and not casually burning down 2 decades of being underestimated. Started with 3 of us in a garage, with almost no funding. We had to pitch 87 investors before someone took us seriously. I lived on my friend's couch for 6 weeks to make rent. Ate rice and beans for most of last year. And now I've got a team of 15, a development pipeline, international partners, and a patent-pending platform that's being rolled out across 6 major cities in Q2. I watched Jake flinch at the numbers, the timelines, the kind of detail that couldn't be faked or fluffed, the kind of language he knew all too well, which meant he also knew I wasn't bluffing. For a man who prided himself on being the smartest in the room, he looked suddenly and profoundly out of his depth. Aunt Carol, who had remained quiet throughout, finally smiled, not a smug smile, not even a triumphant one, but something deeper, something satisfied. She looked at me the way someone looks at a campfire they built themselves, warmth, pride, and a little awe at the fact that it worked. I told you all she wasn't playing around, she said, mostly to the room but a little to herself. But none of you ever listened. Dad opened his mouth, finally, and what came out wasn't what I expected. "Why didn't you say something?" he asked, and there was no accusation in his voice, just genuine confusion. "We had no idea." And that was the moment right there. That was when I understood, in a way I hadn't before, that they didn't know because they never asked. Not really. Not with curiosity. Not with intention. They didn't know because, for years, they'd been so busy fitting me into the quiet, strange, artsy mold that they'd never stopped to wonder if I was becoming someone else. Someone more. Someone real. I stood up slowly, the legs of the chair scraping softly against the hardwood, and the sound seemed to echo in the stillness. "Because I didn't come here for your approval," I said. "I came to say goodbye." And with that, every fork froze, every breath held. Because no one expects the quiet one to walk away. They expect her to forgive, to smile, to accept the half-hearted applause and the too-late compliments and the promise that maybe next time they'll see her better. But I wasn't here for redemption. I was here for closure. "I've got movers coming next week," I added. "New place. New city. New life. And frankly, I'm not sure when I'll be back." Jake looked stunned, like I'd just canceled Christmas. Dad's eyes dropped to the tablecloth. Linda bit her lip, clearly debating whether to say something supportive or just keep pretending to understand what the hell was going on. Only Aunt Carol nodded, like she'd known all along that this wasn't just a visit, it was an exit. And me? I felt light. Not happy. Not vindicated. But finally unburdened. I walked to the kitchen to refill my coffee. Not because I needed more caffeine, but because I needed the space. And as I stood there, hands wrapped around the warm mug, listening to the muffled shuffling of a family stunned into silence, I realized something important, something that felt like the last puzzle piece sliding into place. They hadn't seen me before, not because I was invisible, but because they were too busy looking at their own reflections in each other. But now they were looking at me, and they didn't know what to do with what they saw. The final hours of that Christmas day unfolded not with the warmth and comfort most families try so hard to conjure, through carefully timed gift exchanges, awkward games of charades, or overly sweet slices of pie served with forced laughter, but with a muted awareness that something had shifted irreversibly, as though the ground underneath the living room had quietly cracked open during brunch, and now everyone was carefully stepping around the edges, pretending they didn't notice the divide, stretching wider with each polite, uncertain glance. I stayed through the rest of dessert not because I felt obligated or trapped, but because I wanted to see it, the slow unraveling of an illusion I had once believed was permanent, the unraveling of that false narrative in which I was the well-meaning, slightly eccentric sibling with big dreams and no discipline, who would one day, with a little luck and a lot of humility, settle into a real life. But now every interaction felt different, not because I had changed, but because I had finally said out loud the thing I had always known and they had always refused to accept, that I had outgrown the narrow space they had built for me, and I no longer needed to shrink myself to fit their comfort. Jake, who had once been incapable of going more than 10 minutes without inserting himself at the center of the conversation, had grown uncharacteristically quiet, his usual bravado deflated not by cruelty or confrontation, but by the realization that the story he had been telling himself for decades, that he was the achiever, the benchmark, the golden child, no longer held up under the weight of the truth. He tried once or twice, clumsily, to pivot the mood back to something lighter, something familiar. At one point he even cracked a joke about the next Elon Musk being in our family tree now, but no one laughed. Not even Linda, whose ability to pretend had finally reached its limit. Dad seemed to be processing everything in real time, his posture slightly sunken, his brows furrowed in a way I hadn't seen since Mom's funeral, as though he was sifting through every interaction we'd ever had, every missed opportunity to ask about my life without judgment, and realizing, perhaps for the first time, that being a provider wasn't the same thing as being present. He didn't apologize, not directly, and I didn't expect him to. Men like my father were built from a time when emotional expression was considered a form of weakness, and if you wanted affection, you had to decode it from chores completed, bills paid, or hem carved. But I could tell that something in him had been rattled, and whether or not that would lead to change was no longer my responsibility to manage. I stayed just long enough to help Aunt Carol rinse the dishes, not because I had to, but because she was the only person in that house who had consistently treated me like someone worth listening to, long before the accolades, the acquisition, or the magazine feature. As we stood at the sink, our hands submerged in warm water and the smell of cinnamon and soap hanging in the air like the final chapter of a holiday cookbook, she leaned toward me slightly, not to whisper, but to speak softly. In that way people do when they're giving you something weightier than advice. "You did what most people in this family never had the guts to do," she said without looking at me. "You left the table without asking if it was okay first." And I felt that not just as a compliment, but as a validation of something deeper, something harder to define. I had always known I was different, not in a superior way, but in a way that made coexistence in that house feel like walking a tightrope no one else acknowledged. I had spent years trying to find balance between loving them and surviving them, between staying small enough to be accepted and large enough to breathe. And now I no longer had to balance anything. I had stepped off the rope, not because I fell, but because I built my own damn ground. As I zipped up my coat in the hallway, gray wool, tailored, lined with silk, a purchase I made the day our company hit its Series B target as a reminder that I was allowed to have things that fit, I glanced back into the dining room one last time. The table was half cleared, the kids had retreated upstairs. Linda was whispering something into Jake's ear while casting glances at me she thought were subtle. And Dad was pouring himself a scotch with the deliberateness of someone who didn't want to say goodbye yet, but didn't know how to say anything else either. It wasn't sad. It wasn't dramatic. It was just final. I turned to Aunt Carol and hugged her longer than usual. She didn't speak, and neither did I. Some moments don't need language, they just need presence. Then I opened the front door and stepped into the cold December air, the sharp wind hitting my face like a reset button, not painful, but bracing. The sky was pale, and the driveway was still dusted with the light snow that had fallen earlier that morning, now packed down into slippery patches that would melt by morning. I walked to the rental car slowly, not because I was stalling, but because I wanted to absorb every detail, to remember exactly how it felt to leave not out of anger or rejection, but out of clarity. As I pulled out of the driveway, I didn't look back. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I had already remembered enough. There's this myth people like to sell, especially in families like mine, where tradition is worn like a second skin and forgiveness is expected but rarely offered in return, that you have to come back, that returning is proof of love, of strength, of maturity. But the truth is, sometimes walking away is the most mature thing you can do, the most honest, the most loving to yourself. And I loved them in my own complicated way. But I loved myself more now. I didn't cry on the drive back to the hotel. I didn't feel hollow or vindicated. What I felt, honestly, was something much quieter, much steadier, a kind of peace I hadn't known I was allowed to feel. Not triumph, but freedom. Not revenge, but reclamation. Like I had finally taken back the narrative that had been written about me without my consent, and rewritten it in a language only I understood. As I parked in front of the hotel, the lobby lights glowing gold behind the glass doors, I checked my phone and saw 3 new notifications, one from my CTO, one from our new partners in Berlin, and one from a former investor who had suddenly remembered I existed. I smiled. Not for them. For me. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't need this family's approval, their validation, or their applause to know I was enough. And the most beautiful part? I didn't come to prove anything. I came to let them see. And they finally did.